Hi folks, so got something a little bit different for you today. We're going to look at why intervals are important. Now, my thinking behind this video was that now that we're getting into more conceptual stuff surrounding our favourite session players, you'll notice that I'm describing stuff to you a lot more in terms of intervals. And I kind of appreciate that although some guys might already be thinking and visualising their fretboard this way, not everyone will be. I certainly didn't used to. So I wanted to just do one or two videos to kind of outline how I tend to think about this stuff in the hope that it might help a few of you guys out. So for the first part of this video, I want to give you a few reasons why I think it's really important to understand your intervals. So for number one, it's really useful when it comes to analysing other players. It means that rather than learning a lick verbatim, you can kind of understand musically how it's put together and then recreate stuff in a similar vein by relying on that kind of musical knowledge rather than simply kind of recycling a singular lick. For number two, it really helps us to understand in part why music feels the way it does, which sounds a bit kind of, but really what I mean by that is we all have instinctive leanings towards certain things, certain chord progressions that provoke like an emotional response, or certain kind of solo phrases which we think, it just sounds so badass. And when we start to analyse these things in terms of intervals, we start to see the patterns, and you can kind of go, I can almost recognise like a few favourite chord progressions that I have, or a particular melodic movement that I really like, because I can now see that intervallic pattern in lots of examples of music that I gravitate towards. Okay, number three, it really helps us connect our guitar with music theory. It's kind of, for me, the bridge that brings those two worlds together. I know certainly being someone who teaches music theory to sort of college graduates, it very much kind of ends up being this subject which resides in its own separate dusty little box that doesn't really get open very often, and they'll continue kind of working on all their guitar stuff and theory will be something that's kind of neglected. Intervals is a great way to bridge those two worlds and to get this kind of mutual recycling and feeding of information, where you might learn a new music theory concept and now you have a means of applying it to the guitar, or vice versa. You might learn something really cool on the guitar and then through intervals have the means to explain it in a music theory context. Reason number four, it's really important for developing fretboard knowledge, and this is something which can really cut down on your mental workload. And what I mean by that is, if we are learning a new chord shape, rather than being kind of tied to a book and having to just memorize shape after shape after shape, if we understand the intervals in it, then that's one formula that we have to memorize, and then we can start to visualize different ways of playing that, kind of, pulling it off the top of our head, visualizing where those intervals may be situated in numerous places on the fretboard. And the other thing that's cool about that is that it enables you to start to create your own chord voicings that sound really good to your ear specifically, rather than just what a book tells you is the right thing to do. Number five, our final point, I think is our most important, which is that it's a universal language which is shared by a lot of musicians, and it's one of the most effective ways of communicating musical ideas. So, for example, a fret number isn't going to mean anything to a saxophonist or a keyboard player. That's just not, it's not a physicality they have built into their instrument, so it's not going to mean anything to them. And although note names, saying this is a G sharp, that is something that's definitely, more universally understood, but it doesn't tell you as much as intervals can tell you. So for example, if I'm in a gig with a keyboard player and I say, what voicing are you playing in the pre-chorus? And they say to me, I'm playing 1, 5, 3, flat 7, flat 9. That immediately, in my mind, paints a picture of how that chord is going to sound. It tells me a lot about it before I've even heard it. And that's something, again, that's really unique when it comes to thinking intervals. So whether I've sold you or not, where do we begin with this? Well, for a start, I think intervals and fretboard knowledge are pretty intrinsically linked. They certainly both help each other. So I would really recommend learning the names of the notes on your fretboard. Now, I'm gonna do, I think, a short video on this, a really kind of short but sweet thing over the next week or so, just to give you a few ways of developing this skill quickly, because it's not as intimidating as you think, but it will help you out a lot. So watch out for that. But for now, we can still make inroads into intervals. So let's jump into it. So when it comes to talking about intervals, the major scale is pretty much ground zero. So this is something that often gets relegated to the realm of endless alternate picking exercises and kind of one of those things we begrudgingly think we ought to know. We should practice those scales. But there's way more to it than that. The major scale is actually at the foundation of our whole system of musical harmony in Western music anyway, which means that I can kind of fairly safely proclaim that, 80% of what we deem popular music that you listen to on the radio for the last 100 years or whatever is all derived from the major scale, all the chords that come from there, the arpeggios, the modes, all of it comes from the same place. And so it's really important that we have a very secure understanding of how this scale is built, how to build it on the fretboard, and how to utilize it in different ways. So most importantly, and most interestingly to us, most interesting to us is that pretty much any chord or any melodic idea or lick that we describe when we're describing it to other musicians, it's done so through relation to the major scale. We are relating whatever that information is to the major scale, and that is kind of our foundational understanding, which we refer to. So for example, if I am describing a major 7 chord to somebody, I would describe that as 1, 3, 5, 7, and that simply means from the root note of that chord, which in this case is C, I'm taking the first, the third, the fifth, and the 7th notes of that scale. I miss having my whammy bar today. I'm having to shake things. And when we stack those notes, that's what creates that chord, okay? 1, 3, 5, 7. It's very easy kind of shorthand to convey that information with. Let's take a different chord type. So what about a minor 7? Okay, well, if I were describing a minor 7 chord to somebody, I'd say it's 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7, okay? And we think about it in exactly the same way. Apart from this time, some of the notes are altered. So we have our 1, that wasn't any different. We have our third note from the major scale, but if you remember, when we were talking about the formula, we said flat 3, so that just means it gets moved down 1 fret. A flat lowers a note by a semitone, a sharp raises a note by a semitone. So instead of having, we now have, wow, completely different sound, right? The 5th was intact, so, and then our final note again, whereas previously it was just 7, this time it was flat 7. So we take what was the 7th note of our major scale and we just move it down a fret. Okay. Okay. So in that instance, we had 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7. You can hear a completely different sound, but we are describing this new sound by relating it back to the major scale by saying which notes are still the same as the major scale. and which ones have been changed and how have they been changed. Have they been flattened? Have they been sharpened or whatever? This works the same way when we're talking about scale. So if I'm describing the Lydian mode to somebody, I would say it's 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, 7, and the process would be exactly the same. I'd look at my major scale shape that I know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. How is Lydian different? Oh, it has a sharp 4. So when I get to the 4th note, I'm going to raise it because that's what a sharp does. 1, 2, 3. Ooh, sharp 4, 5. Okay. Now you're probably going, yeah, but how do you know what the formula is? And that's where the work is whenever you're kind of coming across a new chord type or a new scale type or whatever it is committing its formula to memory. So knowing that a major triad is 1, 3, 5, a minor triad is 1 flat 3, 5, etc. But the difference is they're much smaller blocks of information to have to memorize. Whereas if we're like doing this all from chord shapes, we've got potentially dozens of shapes which we're gonna have to try and commit to memory, and it's all the same stuff. I've kind of demonstrated this before, but when I'm moving around the fretboard, it's all the same 3 notes. That's all just 1, 3, 5 in the key of C, and I'm just visualizing where those intervals are. I haven't sat down and necessarily memorized all of these shapes. It's just I'm kind of interacting with the fretboard in a more kind of organic way. It's such a cheesy word, but I'm visualizing things and I'm finding things out rather than just memorizing, if that makes sense. So the long and the short of it is that anything can be described like this. Any lick we do, any chord, whatever, we can describe it in exactly the same way. If I'm describing blues licks, I can describe it in the same way. I'm going 5, okay, flat 7 up to root on the E string, second, flat second down to the root. So it's a really quick way of explaining it to somebody, and also you start to see the patterns in, well, why does that sound bluesy? Well, okay, probably something to do with the flat 2, because that's a note that's outside of the major scale, and this is what I was talking about earlier. Depending on how altered your formula is, as in how many notes have been changed from our starting point in the major scale, it kind of tells you how foreign it's going to sound, how different it's going to sound, how dark or how dissonant it is. And guess what? Generally speaking, the more notes that have been flattened, the darker something sounds. The more notes that have been sharpened, the brighter something sounds. So actually, on a side note, Lydian is deemed to be a brighter sound than the major scale itself, because we've taken the major scale and we've actually raised one of the degrees and sharpened it, which means it's even brighter. So how do we become fluent in seeing the fretboard in this way and understanding it in this way? Well, it has to start with the major scale. We have to know how to form it, we have to know how to form it on the fretboard, and we have to understand how it sounds and what it does and what the weight of it is. So the first kind of vital bit of information to memorize here is going to be the formula for generating a major scale. Now this is a set pattern of tones and semitones, and if you apply this formula starting from any note on the fretboard, you're going to build a major scale in that particular key. Okay, and your formula is this: root, whichever our root note is, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. That's it. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. No matter where you start from, that will create a major scale. I'll demonstrate. So if I start on C, I'm going to do this on 1 string because this is how you should practice it to start with too. Root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So obviously you can see here, a tone on the guitar is 2 frets, a semitone is 1 fret. That's the smallest distance we can move between fretted notes, excluding bending. I'm going to pick another note at random, let's say F sharp, everyone's favourite key, not. Actually, I'm not in F sharp, that's actually E because I'm in drop D. Let's say E, sorry. Root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Okay, it's the same sound. It's that do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And this is the cool thing about music theory, is that once you've learnt one thing, it applies exactly the same way to all 12 keys. So you can just do this at random, pick another note, B flat. And we go root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone, tone. Okay? So that's the first thing. The reason why it's cool to do it on one string first is because it makes it easier to visualize. It means your guitar is looking more like a piano at this point, because we're not trying to deal with going vertically, we're just moving horizontally, which is a lot more linear because the notes just work up in sequence. E, F, F sharp, G, etc., etc. But that's something which we'll cover in the mini lesson this week. So learning and becoming confident in generating the scale horizontally is one of the first things I'd really advise doing, because you start to be able to not only hear but see the distances between all these intervals. Okay, and this is going to really help you later on. The next thing that I think is really, really important to do is to learn the weight and the feel of every interval. Every interval has got a unique thing that it does and a unique way that it feels. And if you learn this and internalize it, it gives you a lot more control when you are part writing or when you're improvising, because you can, it's not down to chance anymore. You know that certain intervals are going to sound very stable and very strong, and certain intervals are going to sound a bit more mysterious. So you start to really kind of, grasp hold of the steering wheel, so to speak. Now I'm going to show you where you can work on this. I've stuck my guitar on drop D so that I can not have to just, go way up the dusty end of the fretboard. And the exercise I'd like you to embark on is a pedal tone exercise. So we are going to build a major scale in the key of D major. So that would be starting at the 5th fret of the A string and using our root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone formula to build the scale. But what we're going to do is use our open now D string to contextualize how the interval actually sounds and actually feels. I'll demonstrate what I mean, okay? So our first note, this is the same note and it's the same interval. It's two versions of a root note, they're just in different octaves. So there's not really going to be much character here. It's kind of like looking in the mirror. You're not bringing anything new into the equation. It is just a reflection of itself. Okay, so obviously really stable. This is why resolving to the root note is often a kind of successful thing to do. Let's move to the next note. This is going to be the second. Okay, so I've got my root, tone. This takes us to the second. The other thing to note here is that when we're kind of very secure with our formula, we simply refer to these degrees as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's it. So our second note. Okay, immediately, way more interesting. It doesn't sound kind of overtly happy or sad. It just sounds kind of cool and sort of settled, and it feels like it's equally happy to move both ways. So I'm kind of like, okay, well, in my brain I go, the second is an interesting interval to improvise around because it diverts us away from the obvious and it takes us to a more unique quality. Let's move up to the third note of the scale. Right, okay, different again. Sounds bright, sounds kind of sort of triumphant. This is a major third, okay? Now the important thing to note here is that I'm just describing this as it comes off the top of my head. The whole point is that this is going to be different to you. You might not go, that's triumphant. You might go, that sounds like Scandinavian black metal to me. It might do. It's completely down to your personal experience, and it's important that you log it in your own way. It's not my job to tell you this is how you should feel when I play this interval. It's down to you to decide how you feel and where you want to use it. Let's keep going. So we go up to the fourth note. Now the fourth is an interesting one because it doesn't feel resolved. It wants to move either down because it's very, very close to the 3, and the 3 is a chord tone, which means it's a very strong sounding interval. Or equally, it kind of feels like it wants to move up to the more settled sound of the fifth, which again is another chord tone. Okay, so if I just do like a bit of very, very simple, very slow, deliberate improvisation using just those first 5 notes, I'm going to be really thinking about how I want it to sound. So I'm going to go, okay. I'm kind of setting up a bit of tension, then resolving it. Yeah, no interest in playing fast whatsoever, not even trying to really phrase. I'm just thinking about how these intervals sound in context, okay? And I know this seems so basic, but you wouldn't believe how long I spent just doing this with different scales to actually learn how it feels to play these different intervals and to sort of take a bit more control with it, okay? So obviously what I'd like you to do is sort of carry on with this exercise all the way up here, because you get the fun of the 7th. That was fun. Obviously you can do this with a backing track if you want to do it in different keys. Get on like a static single chord backing track and then you're free to, you know, use all the strings. Or set up like a loop on a pedal. That's another cool way of doing it. But yeah, spend a good amount of time, slow, deliberate practice. Think about how each interval sounds and feels to you. And start taking control of your improvising, your kind of part writing by rather than just letting the shape boss you around, let our hands boss us around. We're actually using the ears and letting that dictate what your hands do. And that's how you start getting to the point where you hear an idea and then you play it. So of course, you can play these scales horizontally, but the important thing here is not to switch off that part of your brain and just start running scales, okay? I want you to keep track of which interval you're playing at any time. So if you are using a shape you already know, you can still go 1, 7, 2, 3, 4, 6, 5, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, 7, 6 to 7. That's how I would really advise kind of practicing this sort of stuff. And if you want to be really deep with it and even break away from scale shapes altogether, there's a cool thing I learned years ago, which is, I'm just going to stick myself in standard tuning for 1 second. You can take this exercise, which is basically, we're going to use like 5 chromatic notes per string. So we go 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then at this point, you'll notice that I'm keeping my index finger in line with the 5th fret, but I'm stretching that extra one up to the 9th fret. I'm going to do that on every string apart from the G, where we do 4 because of the way it's tuned. And then back to 5. And the thing that we learn from practicing that exercise is how it feels to cross strings chromatically. Meaning, if I go from this note to this note, it's the same as me moving to the next fret. So I start to teach my hands how it feels to cross strings with a distance of a semitone. Basically, it's 1 fret beyond my hand's comfortable reach. Okay, this way you can actually start to build scales freely, just thinking about that tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone structure, rather than being tied to specific kind of scale shapes that you have to practice. The flip side to this is that obviously if we know that a semitone is like one fret out of our comfortable reach, it means that our hand's natural reach is a tone. So from the 8th fret to the 10th fret, it's the same as the 8th fret of the E to the 5th fret of the A. Okay, you just have to watch out for that change in interval here, which means basically it becomes 1 fret smaller. Okay folks, so turbo recap. We talked about why, from my perspective, it's really useful to learn intervals and to think about intervals when you're playing. We have talked about the importance of the major scale and how to create it in any key, moving horizontally, and then also later on talking about how to be able to do it vertically as well. And we've spent a good bit of time talking about the weight and the tension held by every interval and kind of how some of them want to resolve, some of them feel very stable, some of them are kind of a bit more ambiguous in terms of their mood, and how doing really slow, deliberate practice is a great way to start understanding and getting just more connected to your instrument. Okay, hopefully that's given you a few things to work on. I'm going to do a follow-up lesson to this to start talking about, you know, how we can really start to apply this to the fretboard and go kind of deep with it. I might do a bit of like a theory mini-series amongst all the session hero stuff. If you're enjoying it, let me know. If you're like, this sucks, dude, just go back to teaching us licks, then that's cool. And you know, but if you find this has been useful in some way, then I'm happy to keep doing a few more theory-centric things every now and then. Okay guys, have a great week and I will see you next time.